Some discoveries change everything you thought you knew about your life. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old marketing professional from Chicago who thought she had found her perfect match in Marcus Blackwood, a charming antique dealer from rural Tennessee. Their whirlwind romance led to marriage after just 8 months of dating, and Sarah was ready to start a new chapter of her life in the rolling hills of Tennessee. But what Sarah discovered on her new husband's ancestral property would shatter every assumption she had about love, family, and her own future. Hidden among the ancient oak trees and wild honeysuckle vines, she would uncover a secret that had claimed the lives of 43 women over the span of 2 centuries. This is not just a story about a disturbing discovery. It's about a pattern so dark, so methodical, that it defies all logic and reason. What you're about to hear will make you question whether some family legacies are too dangerous to continue, and whether love can truly conquer all. Sarah's first month at the Blackwood family estate felt like stepping into a Southern Gothic novel. The 3-story Victorian house, built in 1847, sat on 200 acres of untamed Tennessee wilderness. Ancient magnolia trees cast long shadows across wraparound porches, while Spanish moss draped the property like funeral shrouds. Marcus had inherited this estate from his grandfather just 2 years before meeting Sarah. He spoke of it with reverence, calling it the heart of the Blackwood legacy. The house itself was stunning but eerily quiet, with 14 rooms that seemed to echo with whispers from the past. It was during her 3rd week there that Sarah decided to explore the woods behind the main house. Marcus had warned her about getting lost, mentioning that the property stretched for miles and contained old hunting trails that led nowhere. But Sarah was an avid hiker, and the October afternoon was too beautiful to waste indoors. She followed a worn path through towering hickory and walnut trees, their leaves creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into golden streams. The air smelled of damp earth and dying leaves, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the gentle babble of a creek. After walking for nearly 30 minutes, Sarah noticed something unusual through the trees. Stone shapes, too uniform to be natural, dotted a small clearing ahead. As she pushed through the undergrowth, her breath caught in her throat. Before her lay a cemetery, but not just any cemetery. 43 weathered headstones stood in perfect rows, some so old that moss had nearly obscured their inscriptions. What made Sarah's blood run cold was the uniformity of it all. Every single headstone bore the surname Blackwood, and as she moved closer to read the inscriptions, a pattern emerged that made her stomach churn. Margaret Blackwood, beloved wife, 1823 to 1847, age 24. Elizabeth Blackwood, devoted wife, 1851 to 1876, age 29. Catherine Blackwood, cherished wife, 1879 to 1901, age 26. Row after row, the pattern continued. Every gravestone belonged to a woman. Every woman had been a wife. And every single one had died young, between the ages of 22 and 35. Sarah pulled out her phone to take pictures, but noticed she had no signal this deep in the woods. The isolation felt suddenly oppressive. As she moved through the cemetery, she began to notice other disturbing details. Many of the death dates were clustered around specific months. October, March, and June seemed particularly common. Several stones bore the same death year, as marriages recorded on others, suggesting rapid turnovers in wives. The newer graves were the most unsettling. The stones from the 1990s and early 2000s looked fresh, their black granite surfaces polished and gleaming. Jessica Blackwood, 1978 to 2003, beloved wife of Thomas. Amanda Blackwood, 1981 to 2009, wife and mother. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized she was looking at recent deaths, women who had lived in the modern era, who had probably driven cars and used cell phones and lived lives not so different from her own. When she finally made it back to the house, the sun was setting, casting the Victorian mansion in deep shadows. Marcus was waiting on the front porch, his usual warm smile notably absent. "Where have you been, Sarah?" "I was worried sick." "I found something in the woods," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. A cemetery. A family cemetery. Marcus's expression darkened. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely angry. You shouldn't have gone back there alone. Those woods can be dangerous. Old hunting traps, unstable ground. Marcus, there are 43 graves back there. All women. All Blackwoods. It's just the old family plot, Sarah. Nothing to concern yourself with. My ancestors have been buried there for generations. But something in his tone made Sarah's skin crawl. It was the same tone he'd used when deflecting questions about his previous relationships, or why he'd never mentioned any living female relatives. That night, as Marcus slept beside her, Sarah stared at the ceiling and wondered what kind of family produces 43 dead wives in less than 200 years. Sarah couldn't sleep. The image of those perfectly aligned headstones haunted her, and Marcus's dismissive reaction only deepened her unease. The next morning, while he drove into town for supplies, she decided to investigate further. The Blackwood house contained an extensive library, with genealogy records dating back to the family's arrival in Tennessee in 1820. Sarah spent hours poring over marriage certificates, death records, and family Bibles that documented generations of Blackwood men and their wives. The pattern that emerged was more disturbing than anything she could have imagined. The first Blackwood patriarch, Ezekiel, had arrived from Scotland with his wife Mary. Mary died within a year, and Ezekiel quickly remarried. His second wife, Sarah's namesake, lasted 2 years before succumbing to what the records vaguely described as a wasting illness. Ezekiel married 5 times in total, each wife dying under mysterious circumstances. His son Thomas continued the pattern. 7 wives over 30 years, each death attributed to different causes. Consumption, fever, accidents, and in one disturbing case, walked into the woods and never returned. But it was the 20th century records that made Sarah's blood run cold. She found newspaper clippings, medical records, and police reports that painted a picture of systematic tragedy. In 1934, Dorothy Blackwood died of poisoned mushrooms she had supposedly gathered herself, despite being an experienced forager. In 1952, Helen Blackwood drowned in the creek behind the house, despite being a competitive swimmer in college. The records showed that Marcus's own grandfather, William Blackwood, had been married 6 times between 1960 and 1995. Each wife died within 5 years of marriage. The local newspaper had even run a piece in 1987 titled The Blackwood Curse. Tragedy strikes again, but the article had been mysteriously retracted the next day. What disturbed Sarah most was discovering that Marcus's father, Thomas Blackwood Jr., had been married 4 times before his own death in 2019. His last wife, Rebecca, had died just months before Marcus inherited the property. The death certificate listed cause of death as cardiac arrest, but Rebecca had been only 31 years old with no history of heart problems. Sarah found medical records hidden in a locked drawer that she managed to pry open. Rebecca Blackwood had been seeing a doctor for symptoms that seemed impossible: premature aging, hair loss, extreme fatigue, and what the doctor described as cellular deterioration consistent with rapid aging syndrome. The doctor had recommended immediate hospitalization for further testing, but Rebecca had died at home before the appointment. As Sarah read through more records, she realized that many of the Blackwood wives had experienced similar symptoms before their deaths. The earlier records used terms like wasting sickness and premature decline, but the modern medical records were more specific: cellular breakdown, immune system failure, and in several cases, what appeared to be accelerated aging. She also discovered that every Blackwood man seemed to remarry with unusual speed. The longest gap between a wife's death and the next marriage was 8 months. Most remarried within 3 to 4 months, as if they were on some kind of schedule. The library also contained hundreds of love letters, but reading them made Sarah's skin crawl. The language was almost identical across different time periods and different men. The same pet names, the same promises, even the same romantic gestures appeared in letters spanning nearly 2 centuries. when she found a box of letters that Marcus had written to his previous girlfriend, letters that were nearly word-for-word identical to the ones he'd written to her during their courtship, Sarah realized that the Blackwood men weren't just following a pattern of marriage and death. They were following a script. As evening approached, Sarah heard Marcus's truck returning up the long gravel driveway. She quickly returned the records to their places and tried to act normal, but her mind was racing with questions she was afraid to ask. What do you think about what Sarah has discovered so far? Have you ever uncovered disturbing family secrets that changed how you saw someone you loved? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. During the day, while Marcus worked in his antique shop in town, she felt eyes on her whenever she moved through the house. At night, she heard footsteps in the halls above their bedroom, despite Marcus being sound asleep beside her. On her 5th day alone in the house, Sarah discovered the attic. She had been exploring the 3rd floor when she noticed a narrow door partially hidden behind an antique armoire. When she managed to push the heavy furniture aside, she found a steep staircase leading to a space she hadn't known existed. The attic was larger than she expected, running the full length of the house. Dusty sunlight filtered through a single window, illuminating stacks of trunks, old furniture, and dozens of oil paintings covered by white sheets. But what drew Sarah's attention immediately was a writing desk positioned directly beneath the window, with an open journal lying on top. The journal was bound in cracked leather, and the pages were yellowed with age. The handwriting on the open page was feminine and elegant, but the words made Sarah's hand shake. October 15th, 1847. I fear I have made a terrible mistake in marrying into this family. The women before me tried to warn me, but I thought their stories were mere superstition. Now I understand the truth. There is something in this house, something ancient and hungry, that feeds on wives. Ezekiel knows, just as his father knew, and his father before him. They are not victims of this curse. They are its servants. Sarah flipped through more pages, finding entries that grew increasingly desperate. October 20th. My hair is falling out in clumps. My reflection shows a woman 20 years older than I was a month ago. The thing in the walls whispers to me at night, telling me about the others who came before. Margaret, who tried to run. Elizabeth, who fought back. Catherine, who attempted to burn the house down. All failed. All died. October 25th. I found a ritual room in the basement. The symbols carved into stone walls, the altar stained with blood from generations of sacrifices. The Blackwood men don't love us. They harvest us. Our youth, our life force, our very essence feeds the thing that has protected their family line for 2 centuries. The final entry was barely legible, the handwriting shaky and weak. October 31st. It's too late for me, but perhaps someone will find this journal. The curse can be broken, but only by destroying the source. In the basement, behind the wine cellar, there is a room that should not exist. In that room is an altar older than this house, older than the Blackwood line. The entity was bound to the family through blood sacrifice, and only through blood can it be unbound. If you are reading this, you are likely the next sacrifice. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait. Act while you still have strength. Sarah dropped the journal with shaking hands. The signature at the bottom of the final entry read, Mary Blackwood, 1847, the first wife buried in the family cemetery. As she searched through the other trunks in the attic, Sarah found similar journals, dozens of them. Nearly every woman buried in that cemetery had left behind a record of her final days, and they all told the same story. A parasitic entity that fed on the life force of young women, sustained by the complicity of the Blackwood men who served as its procurers. Some journals contained detailed drawings of symbols, ritual implements, and what appeared to be architectural plans of the house's basement. Others included pressed flowers, locks of hair, and what looked like primitive protection charms that had clearly failed their owners. One journal from the 1960s contained Polaroid photographs that made Sarah's stomach turn. Images of women in various stages of what could only be described as accelerated decay, their faces gaunt, their hair white, their skin wrinkled and spotted like women in their 80s, despite being in their 20s and 30s. The most recent journal belonged to Rebecca Blackwood, Marcus's father's last wife. Her entries were typed on loose sheets of paper, and they contained information that the historical accounts had lacked. The entity isn't native to this land. Thomas's great-great-grandfather brought it with him from Scotland, bound to an ancient stone that now sits beneath the house. The creature feeds on female life essence, but it can only take willing sacrifices, women who have married into the family of their own free will. That's why the Blackwood men are such perfect suitors. They have to make us fall in love, make us choose them, before the feeding can begin. The men age normally, but the women who marry them have their life force drained to extend the family line. Thomas will live well into his hundreds, as did his father and grandfather before him. The cost is measured in dead wives. I've been married for 3 years, and I can feel it working on me every day. The exhaustion, the way my hair has lost its color, how my face shows lines that shouldn't be there for another 20 years. I tried to leave, but I can't get past the property line. Something prevents me from leaving, like an invisible barrier that grows stronger the weaker I become. As Sarah read these accounts, she realized that every Blackwood wife had discovered the truth eventually, and every single one had tried to escape or fight back. None had succeeded. Thank you so much for staying with this story up to this point. We truly appreciate your time and attention. I assure you that the most shocking revelations are still to come, and what you'll discover in the remaining chapters will leave you completely stunned. That night, Sarah couldn't bring herself to sleep in the same bed as Marcus. She told him she wasn't feeling well and spent the night on the living room couch, but she was actually planning her escape. If what the journal said was true, she needed to get away from the property as soon as possible. At 3 a.m., when she was certain Marcus was asleep, Sarah crept out of the house and made her way to her car. But when she turned the key, nothing happened. She tried again and again, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. Her cell phone, which had been fully charged when she went to bed, was now completely dead despite being plugged in all night. Panicking, Sarah decided to walk to the main road. It was only 3 miles through the woods, and once she reached the highway, she had flagged down help. But as she walked down the long gravel driveway, she felt an increasing resistance, as if she were walking against a strong wind. The closer she got to property boundary, the harder it became to move forward. By the time she reached the stone pillars that marked the entrance to the Blackwood estate, each step required enormous effort. When she tried to pass between the pillars, she hit what felt like an invisible wall. She could see the road beyond, could see a car's headlights in the distance, but she couldn't move another inch forward. Defeated and terrified, Sarah made her way back to the house. But instead of going inside, she decided to visit the cemetery one more time. If she was trapped on this property, she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. The October moon was full, casting silver light through the bare branches of the oak trees. The cemetery looked different at night, more ominous, more alive somehow. As Sarah moved between the headstones, she could swear she heard whispers in the wind, voices of the women buried beneath her feet. But as she reached the far end of the cemetery, she saw something that made her scream. A 44th headstone had been added since her last visit. The granite was so new it still gleamed in the moonlight, and the inscription made her blood freeze. Sarah Mitchell Blackwood, beloved wife, 1995 to 2023. She found peace in death. The death date was only 3 days away. I see you found your final resting place. Sarah spun around to find Marcus standing at the edge of the cemetery, but he looked different now. The warm, loving expression she had fallen in love with was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. In the moonlight, she could see that his face looked younger than it had when they first met, as if he were aging in reverse. "How long have you known?" Sarah asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "About the family legacy? I've known my whole life. My father explained it to me when I turned 18, just as his father explained it to him. The Blackwood men live long, prosperous lives. The price is that we must provide the entity with what it needs to sustain us. And what I need... Sarah's voice cracked. What about my life, my dreams, my future? Marcus's expression softened slightly, but it wasn't with love. It was with pity. Sarah, you were chosen specifically for this purpose. I researched you for months before we met. Orphan at 16, no close family, a job that allows for remote work. No one will look too hard when you disappear. The few friends you have will assume we moved somewhere remote to start our new life together. The other women tried to escape. They all did, and they all failed, just as you will. The entity has had 2 centuries to perfect its hold on this place. You can't leave, you can't call for help, and you can't fight what's happening to your body. I've seen it 43 times. Sarah, I know how this ends. Sarah backed away from him, but found herself pressed against a large oak tree. What is it? What kind of creature does this? Something old. Something that my ancestor should never have made a bargain with. But the deal was struck, and it can't be undone. Every generation of Blackwood men must provide wives for the entity to feed on. In exchange, we live 3 times longer than normal men. We never know poverty or serious illness, and our bloodline continues. And you're okay with this? You're okay with murdering innocent women? Marcus looked genuinely confused by her question. Murder? Sarah, you'll die peacefully. The feeding process isn't painful. You'll just gradually grow weaker until you slip away in your sleep. Many of the women said it was almost euphoric toward the end. Listen to yourself. You're talking about draining my life away like I'm cattle. You're being dramatic. This is simply the natural order of things in our family. The women give their lives, and the men use that sacrifice to build something lasting. Look around you. This estate, the wealth, the history. Your death will be part of something greater than yourself. Sarah realized that Marcus wasn't evil in the conventional sense. He was something worse. He was a man who had been raised to see women as disposable resources, to view their deaths as necessary and even noble sacrifices. He genuinely couldn't understand why she was upset about being murdered. The other women. Did you love any of them? Marcus considered this question seriously. I suppose I felt affection for some more than others. Rebecca was particularly intelligent, and Jessica had a wonderful sense of humor. But love... He shrugged. Love implies equality, doesn't it? You don't love your food, Sarah. You appreciate it. You might even prefer one dish over another, but you don't love it. As the full horror of her situation sank in, Sarah realized that her death was only 3 days away, and she was trapped on a property with a man who saw her as nothing more than a meal for his family's pet monster. Sarah had 48 hours to live, and she wasn't going to spend them cowering in fear. If 43 women before her had tried and failed to break free, perhaps they hadn't tried the right approach. She spent the next day pretending to accept her fate, telling Marcus that she understood her role and was prepared to fulfill it. He seemed relieved by her apparent compliance and became almost tender, bringing her flowers from the garden and preparing elaborate meals, as if they were celebrating rather than conducting a countdown to her death. But while Marcus busied himself with what he probably considered romantic gestures, Sarah was studying every journal in the attic, looking for information the other women might have missed. She found it in Mary Blackwood's journal, in an entry she had initially overlooked. Mary had discovered that the entity wasn't invincible. It was bound to the physical world by the stone altar in the basement, and that altar could be destroyed. But the process required a willing sacrifice of a different kind. According to Mary's research, which had involved weeks of communication with the entity itself, the creature could only be banished if a Blackwood man willingly gave up his extended life. The entity's power came from the deal struck generations ago, and only someone carrying the Blackwood bloodline could break that contract. The problem was that no Blackwood man would ever voluntarily give up his supernatural longevity. The entity had chosen servants well, men who valued their own survival above everything else. But Sarah had an idea. That evening, She asked Marcus to show her the basement ritual room. She told him she wanted to understand what would happen to her, to prepare herself mentally for the process. Marcus seemed touched by what he interpreted as her acceptance, and he gladly led her down to the stone chamber beneath the house. The ritual room was exactly as the journals had described it. Ancient symbols were carved deep into the stone walls, and in the center of the room stood an altar made of the same black stone that the Blackwood ancestor had brought from Scotland. The altar was stained with what could only be centuries of blood, and the air around it seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly presence. "Tomorrow night, you'll lie on the altar," Marcus explained matter-of-factly. "The entity will begin the final feeding process. You'll feel weak at first, then drowsy. Most women fall asleep and never wake up. It's really quite peaceful. Will you be here with me?" "Of course. I'm always present for the final feeding. It's part of the ritual." Sarah nodded, as if this information comforted her. But she was actually planning something that no previous wife had attempted. The next evening, Sarah dressed in the white gown that Marcus had provided. Apparently, it was traditional for the sacrifice to wear white. She had hidden a hammer and chisel from Marcus's workshop in the folds of the dress, along with a kitchen knife she had taken earlier that day. When they reached the ritual room, Sarah lay down on the altar as instructed. Marcus began reading from an ancient book written in a language she didn't recognize. As he chanted, the air in the room grew thick and oppressive, and Sarah could feel something invisible and hungry pressing against her consciousness. But instead of submitting to the entity, Sarah sat up suddenly and drove the kitchen knife deep into her own palm. Blood flowed freely from a wound, and Marcus stopped chanting in shock. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "I'm making my own bargain," Sarah said through gritted teeth. Her blood was dripping onto the altar, and the entity's presence grew stronger, more attentive. Speaking to the darkness around them, Sarah offered a proposal. "I know you can understand me. I offer you something better than my life force drained over several weeks. I offer you the immediate death of a Blackwood bloodline carrier. Marcus has no children, no brothers. If he dies tonight, your supply of wives ends forever. But if you let me live, if you release me from this place, I'll find a way to send you other Blackwood men. There are distant cousins, relatives who don't know about the family curse. I'll bring them here willingly." The presence in the room shifted. Considering her offer, Marcus was backing toward the door, finally understanding that Sarah wasn't the compliant victim he had expected. "You can't bargain with it," Marcus said, but his voice betrayed his fear. "The contract was made with my bloodline. It can't simply transfer to someone else." "But it can be renegotiated," Sarah replied, still speaking to the entity rather than to Marcus. "Especially by someone willing to spill Blackwood blood on your altar." Before Marcus could escape, Sarah lunged from the altar and tackled him to the ground. The knife was still embedded in her palm, making her grip slippery, but desperation gave her strength. They fought viciously, but Marcus had underestimated how determined a woman facing death could be. When Sarah finally managed to drive the blade into Marcus's chest, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The entity's presence exploded the room like a shockwave, and Marcus began aging rapidly. His face wrinkled, his hair turned white, and his skin became paper-thin as 2 centuries of borrowed time caught up with him in seconds. With his dying breath, Marcus whispered, "You don't understand what you've done. Without the contract, it's free. It's not bound to this place anymore." As Marcus's body crumbled to dust, Sarah felt the oppressive presence lift from the room. The altar began to crack, and the symbols carved into the walls started to fade. But Marcus's final words echoed in her mind. Had she freed herself, or had she released something terrible into the world? Sarah ran from the basement as the house began to shake. She made it to her car, which started immediately now that the entity's hold on the property was broken. As she drove away from the Blackwood estate, she could see in her rear-view mirror that the entire house was collapsing on itself, as if 2 centuries of supernatural preservation were being undone all at once. 3 months later, Sarah was living under a new name in Oregon. try and convince herself that she had done the right thing. But sometimes, on quiet nights, she wondered if something dark and hungry was now loose in the world because of her choice. And sometimes, she received news clippings about mysterious deaths in other parts of the country. Young women found drained of life, aged beyond their years. Had Sarah escaped the Blackwood curse, or had she simply passed it on to others? The truth might be more terrifying than the fate she had fought so desperately to avoid. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about family legacies and the prices we're willing to pay for survival. Sarah's choice to break a centuries-old curse by potentially releasing a greater evil reflects the impossible decisions we sometimes face when every option leads to harm. What would you have done in Sarah's situation? Would you have accepted your fate to prevent something worse from being unleashed? Or would you have fought for your freedom regardless of the consequences? Have you ever discovered family secrets that changed everything you thought you knew about the people you loved? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective on these impossible moral choices could help others who are facing their own dark family legacies. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell for more true stories that explore the darkest corners of human experience. Your support helps us continue bringing you these intense, real-life accounts that remind us that sometimes truth is more terrifying than fiction. Don't miss our next video. The basement my mother-in-law left me had 12 coffins, a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about inheritance and family gifts. Click the screen now to watch a tale that's even more disturbing than what you just heard.